Andrew, here's a question that I myself am wondering the answer to as we're having this conversation, but I'm going to pose it to you. If there is a failure, or if you fail, does it always mean that you've made a mistake?
That's a good question. I suppose you could always have had more information. You could have always found ways to prepare more. But I don't think that's realistic. And I think those that are stuck in that kind of neutral gear um, don't move forward the way that they ought. So I have a chapter in the book that, essentially is anchored around a Jesse Isler quote of, he says, "My life has been ready, fire, aim, and it's been one of venture." Right? And he's a wildly successful, entrepreneur, rapper, owns an NBA team, all of that. And I kind of tweak that just a little bit and say, you know, approach things with a ready, uh, you know, uh, ready, fire, adjust your aim in flight kind of, approach, right? You can't wait for perfect conditions to get something started.
Mm-hmm.
You take as much input as you can, seek as much wisdom and information as you can, but at a certain point, you have to just get started and then let the failures come and deal with them as they come to the best of your ability. I talk about kind of the duality of the Peter Thiel from Zero to One quote about you know having a bad plan is better than having no plan at all. You still need a plan. So the duality of that versus Mike Tyson saying it's great to have a plan until you get punched in the mouth. And I think both are true. Like you need to have a plan, but you might get punched in the mouth. So prepare to iterate along the way as failures and roadblocks and detours are presented.
Mm-hmm. What are the five rules in the book?
Failure rule number one is failure purifies. So again, it's the idea of the phoenix must burn to emerge. That oftentimes our failures are a way of kind of burning off the kind of incidental slop that builds into our lives, whether it's stale or bad ways of thinking, whether it's relationships that aren't serving us, whether it's a career path that isn't serving us. And I think sometimes in those failure moments where we feel like everything's falling apart, we need to step back and take a look and see what's being burned off of us and think about how that might actually be good for us as we now have an opportunity to kind of reshape our thinking or reorganize our life to move forward in a stronger or more holistic way. So that's failure rule number one is failure purifies. Failure rule number two is nothing is safe. And I have many examples of this rule in the book. I think most notably I talk about Mike Rowe and how he had an episode of Dirty Jobs called Safety Third, which was really just to say, not necessarily put safety third, but let's not put safety first all the time. Let's really look at safety as something that needs to be weighed against other competing priorities that might have higher value than safety. And I think that's an important lens to view yourself in as an entrepreneur, as a creative, if you're doing something bold or something, where you're coloring outside the lines. And failure rule number three is money is spiritual, which really kind of stems from a quote from Rabbi Daniel Lapin, author of Thou Shalt Prosper. Just this idea that if you're avoiding the failure territory of envy and greed, and you're viewing money properly, where you're not worshiping money, nor are you reviling it. You're using it really as a thank you note, where every day you go through these transactions, and in each one, you're putting placed value on something, which is really a representation of your measured thankfulness, right? And in that way, money really can be a kind of dispassionate tool to be a multiplier of blessings, to really help people help themselves and help others. And I think so kind of the glorification and the demonization of money needs to be avoided as failure spaces. And we can view money as really this tool of spirituality to invoke and evoke blessings in our lives. Failure number four goes back to what we were just talking about, which is failure prevention. So it's a strategy for preventing failure. I call it the thing one and thing two dependency, which has nothing to do with Cat in the Hat. It's more imagining a disheveled Tony Soprano waking up in his white bathrobe, lighting his first cigar of the day, and saying, "Hey, you got the thing one here, thing one enabler with your thing two pursuit, and they got to go together." So it's like thing one is your enabler pursuit, which is kind of potentially that low meaning pursuit that provides stability, financial undergirding, and just a platform for you to be able then in your off hours, pursue a North Star pursuit, which might be a higher representation of your highest usefulness in the world. I go through many examples of that in the book. Most notably, there's a record label from Boston called Bridge 9 Records. The owner, Chris Wren, launched that label by building an enabler pursuit, his Thing One, to pay for it, which was a merchandise company called Yankee Suck, where he would go, at Fenway and sell all this merchandise to the Boston fans who hated the Yankees. And while it might have been good money chasing after bad, he used the profits from that to then kickstart his record labels and underwrite his first 15, 16 releases. And so it's those creative types of ways of creating a Thing One, Thing Two dependency that I detail in the book, which I think is a good failure prevention mentality as people go about trying to pursue their North Star dreams. Failure rule number 5 is you are not your failures. So this is the idea of decoupling your failure events from your identity and seeing them just as events that you can learn from, that you can, be purified from, reference back to failure rule number 1. And so I go through a variety of case studies in the book about that. Everything from former gang leader Elgin James, who's actually the brother of Jocko Willink, and he was a gang leader for a violent, militant, straight-edge, hardcore gang that would beat up anybody that used drugs or alcohol at punk rock shows in the late 90s and early 2000s. He then redeemed himself, detached himself from his negative identity, rebuilt his reputation while still serving time for an extortion charge, became a mentee of Robert Redford, became a screenwriter, and was a screenwriter for Mayans FX, the spinoff to Sons of Anarchy on FX. So I go through his story. I go through commentator Glenn Beck's story of how prior to him being who he was a divorced alcoholic DJ, dabbled in cocaine use, was obnoxious to everybody around him, found God, found purpose, decoupled himself from his failures and found a way to pursue his North Star dream in that pivot. So it's stories like that I go through that kind of connect to failure rule number 5, you are not your failures.
I hear that. And when you were writing the book, did you directly reach out to some of these people that you've mentioned, or these people you've met or know or have conversations with?
Yeah, some of them.
Okay.
Those that I knew, and I would kind of go back and forth with them on what I was thinking. And others I did not. I mean, the stories are public, and I just kind of extracted them from what is known and what is public.
Got it. Yeah, no, it's interesting because a few of those names are people I've met and know personally to some degree. Some of them have been on this podcast. I've been on some of their podcasts, and when you mention guys like James Altucher, I've spoken to many times. Glenn Beck, I've spoken to and met several times, and seen everything he's built there with the Blaze. And it's even interesting looking at certain people's backstories, because sometimes it seems so far removed from where they are now that you can't even really imagine they went through all that, or that it's even the same human being. Sometimes it doesn't even seem like the same person. And I think there's something very fascinating about that. I'm deeply interested, as I'm sure you are yourself, just as about what I'd call the human condition.
Yes.
Right? We live in this, whether now or historically, I think human beings are the most interesting thing on the planet, and life is this incredible combination of joy and sadness and success and tragedy and failure and unavoidable catastrophe and avoidable catastrophe and all of this stuff. I mean, it's complicated enough on an individual level, and then when you take millions, hundreds of millions, billions of people, put them all on the planet and have them interact with each other, it's complicated. I think it's beautiful, but it's very complicated. It can get dark. It can get wonderful. It can get to the point where you have days and times where you feel this real love for humanity, and then other times where there's this darkness and you're just like, oh my gosh, what is wrong with human beings, and how on earth they're, especially when you read through history or you see certain things going on around the world, and you're just like, what is up with people?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. You mentioned meeting James Altucher and Glenn Beck. I mean, their stories really resonated with me. If I had not read Choose Yourself by James Altucher, I don't think I would have written this book. If I had not been introduced to who James Altucher was by hearing him on the Glenn Beck program, I wouldn't have written this book. So it's like these kind of connections do inspire, right? And if both of them held on to identifying closely with their failure events, they would not have resurrected from them and became who they became, which has gone on to influence and impact and bless others with their stories and their message. I just find that inspiring, fascinating, and really full of hope. And that's kind of why I wrote this book. I wrote this book and I'm putting a lot of effort into building kind of the tentacles around getting the book out there, because I believe that these stories have power. I believe that these messages, these lessons, these rules have power to really potentially be, at least one of the pieces to help somebody put their life back together in certain crucible moments. I was talking to a friend the other day who, decades ago was a crack addict, was a criminal, was a thief, and now is in a high position in a very strong organization. And he was talking to me about the book and actually talking to me about my son who's in recovery from addiction and going through some struggles. And he's like, you don't know what the arc of time is going to show. He was talking about failure rule number 5, you are not your failures, and how he's learned to kind of invoke that in his own life to get to where he has and have that contrast of his current self versus his past self. And I just think that message of people learning how to appropriately shed the failures of the past, particularly ones that might be more ethical failures, with an acknowledgement that you're still going to have messiness and consequences you have to deal with. It's not like you can just, cause harm or cause dysfunction and walk away clean, right? You still have to deal with those results, but there is that light on the other side if you choose to chase after it.